In 2013, a quiet but restless 19-year-old named Laura Pryor Palmer did something utterly spontaneous. She signed up for the Mongol Derby, the most dangerous and grueling horse race in the world. Held annually across the vast, uncharted Mongolian steppe, the Derby spans over 1,000 kilometers, retracing the ancient postal route of Genghis Khan. Riders brave untamed wilderness, scorching days, freezing nights, and ride some of the most feral horses on the planet. Laura had almost no time to prepare. While other competitors had spent years training their bodies and minds for this ordeal, Laura had only a few short weeks. She wasn't even sure why she was doing it, maybe to prove something to herself, or perhaps just for the thrill. Her family thought she was crazy, but Laura didn't care. She was an underdog in every sense. Her biggest rival, Devin Horn, was a fierce, athletic American rider in her mid-20s. Devin had been training for years, known for her aggressive riding style and iron will. She had all the tools to dominate this race: experience, strategy, and determination. By contrast, Laura was considered a long shot, and even she knew it. The Mongol Derby has a notorious rule. Every rider must change horses every 40 kilometers. That's right, riders don't have their own horses. Instead, they are given the wild, semi-feral Mongolian horses at each checkpoint, animals bred for endurance, but with minds of their own. These horses don't care if you're a skilled rider or a beginner. They will buck, kick, and sometimes run off into the horizon. Every horse is a gamble. The first morning of the race, Laura approached her horse. It was a small, muscular, wild-eyed stallion, twitching with nervous energy. It didn't care for the weight of a saddle or the command of a rider. Laura, already nervous, tightened her grip on the reins as she mounted. The second she was on, the horse reared up, nearly throwing her off. She could barely hang on as the stallion bolted, galloping uncontrollably across the steppe. Meanwhile, Devin Horn was off to a lightning start. She had gotten a strong, compliant horse and was already several kilometers ahead. She thundered across the plains, pushing her horse faster and faster. Everyone expected Devin to win. She was built for this race. But Lara's journey was the opposite. Every horse seemed to fight her. One refused to move at all. Another bucked wildly for miles, testing her endurance. Would she even finish the first day? By the time the first night fell, Devin had secured a significant lead, galloping far ahead of the pack. But Laura, lagging far behind, wasn't giving up. Not yet. That night, the temperature on the Mongolian steppe plummeted. The riders, scattered across the wilderness, had to camp out under the stars with little more than a thin blanket and a tent. The wind picked up, howling across the barren landscape, and soon, a brutal storm rolled in. As the storm descended, Lara's situation became increasingly dire. She and her horse were completely exposed to the elements. The cold, biting wind cut through her thin layers, and her tent did little to shield her from the freezing rain. Her hands were numb, her breath visible in the freezing night. Her horse shivered beside her. By midnight, the storm had escalated into a full-blown tempest, and Laura feared she wouldn't survive the night. She lay shivering next to her horse, praying the animal's body heat would keep her from freezing to death. Meanwhile, other riders were pulling out of the race entirely. Many couldn't cope with the severe conditions. Some horses had wandered off into the darkness, and riders were left stranded. But through sheer will, Laura made it through the night. Barely. At dawn, she dragged herself to her feet, saddle sore and exhausted. But there was no time to rest. The race was still on, and she had to catch up. Devin, however, had pushed ahead, seemingly unaffected by the storm. She was ruthless, racing through the pain, determined to cross the finish line first. Her focus was laser-sharp, but could she keep up this pace for another 500 kilometers? Halfway through the race, disaster struck for Laura. While galloping across the steppe, trying to gain ground, she was suddenly hit by an intense wave of nausea and stomach pain. She felt weak and dizzy, barely able to keep her balance in the saddle. Each bump of the horse's gallop felt like a hammer pounding in her gut. Eventually, she couldn't take it anymore. She dismounted, collapsing onto the ground. Was it heat exhaustion? Food poisoning? She didn't know, but the pain was unbearable. As she lay there, pale and shaking, she began to wonder if this was the end of her race. Her body had simply given out. Hours passed, and Laura was stuck at a remote checkpoint, resting in a small yurt with a Mongolian family. Riders were zooming past her. Devin Horn was now nearly 100 kilometers ahead, firmly in control of the race. But then, in a twist of fate, Lara's illness began to subside. Her fever broke overnight. Still weak, but determined, she mounted her next horse and continued. While Laura was recovering, Devin was making her move. She had built up a huge lead and was pushing her horses to their limits, galloping for hours without stopping. But as she neared one of the final checkpoints, her aggressive strategy caught up to her. At the checkpoint, every rider's horse has to pass a veterinary inspection. If the horse is too tired or injured, the rider is forced to wait until the horse recovers, or worse, face disqualification. As Devon reached the vet check, disaster struck. Her horse was found to be in critical condition, exhausted from the brutal pace. The vets refused to let her continue until the horse had recovered. Devon was furious but powerless. She was forced to sit at the checkpoint for hours, watching her lead slip away. All the while, Lara was inching closer, slowly but surely closing the gap. With just one day left, the race had come down to Lara and Devon. Against all odds, Lara was now within striking distance, but it would take a final 80-kilometer sprint through the roughest, steepest terrain to determine the winner. The hills were treacherous, and both women were exhausted beyond words. Every muscle in their bodies ached. Every breath was labored. Devon, furious at her bad luck, pushed her horse even harder, refusing to be overtaken. But in the final stretch, something incredible happened. Lara, riding a spirited horse that seemed to sense the urgency, found herself neck and neck with Devon. With just 10 kilometers to go, the unthinkable happened. Lara's horse stumbled on loose rocks, throwing her to the ground with a sickening thud. For a moment, it seemed like her race was over, but she forced herself up, bruised and bleeding. In a haze of pain, she mounted her horse again, heart pounding. Devon was just ahead, but her horse was slowing down, exhausted from days of relentless pushing. In the final moments, Lara surged past her, riding with every ounce of strength left in her. She crossed the finish line. To the shock of everyone watching, Lara Pryor Palmer had won, the youngest competitor ever, and the first British rider to claim victory in the Mongol Derby. Devon, devastated, crossed moments later. She had dominated the race for days, but had been beaten by the one thing she hadn't prepared for, an underdog who refused to quit. In the end, Lara's victory was as much about grit and determination as it was about skill. She had survived storms, illness, wild horses, and near-fatal falls. No one had expected her to win, least of all herself. But that's the thing about the Mongol Derby. It's not always the strongest or the fastest who come out on top. Sometimes it's the one who keeps going, no matter what stands in their way. Be sure to like and subscribe for more crazy real-life stories like this one.